Jumping from his tank, Hollingsworth reconnoitred to see if he could both lead the way and direct his gunner's fire via the telephone hooked to the back of the tank. At that instant, an anti-tank shell exploded 15 yards ahead of Hollingsworth. Cobblestone fragments flew through the air, and suddenly the Major found his face was a mass of blood. A .45 in one hand and the tank telephone in the other, he doggedly moved toward the bridge. His tank collided with a jeep, and Hollingsworth called for infantrymen. Leading them onto the approach, he began working his way through the roadblocks, exchanging steady fire with the Germans, who were fiercely defending the way. A bullet struck him in the left knee, but he kept the lead, urging the infantry on. At last, staggering and half-blinded by his own blood, Hollingsworth was stopped. A rain of fire was coming from the German positions, and Hollingsworth was forced to order a withdrawal. He had come to within 40 feet of the bridge. When Colonel Disney, his commanding officer, arrived on the scene, he found the Major unable to walk and bleeding all over the place. I ordered him back to the rear. Hollingsworth had missed taking the bridge by minutes. Had he succeeded, he believed he could have reached Berlin within 11 hours. At dawn on April 12th, as infantry and engineers tried once again to seize the Schönebeck Bridge, the Germans blew it up in their faces. High above the Ninth Army front, Lieutenant Duane Francis put the unarmed spotting plane, the Piper Cub Miss Me, into a wide turn. Riding behind Francis was his artillery observer, Lieutenant William S. Martin. The two men had scouted for the 5th Armoured all the way from the Rhine, locating strongpoints and radioing the positions to the oncoming tanks. It was not all routine work. More than once, Francis and Martin had buzzed enemy troops, taking potshots at columns with their Colt .45s. Off to the east, the clouds had opened, and the flyers could see chimney stacks faint in the distance. "Berlin!" Francis shouted, pointing ahead. "The factories at Spandau!" Each day now, as the 5th advanced steadily, Francis searched for different city landmarks from his lofty vantage point. When the Miss Me led the tanks into Berlin, the young pilot wanted to be able to recognize instantly the main roads and buildings, so as to inform the tankers about them. He intended to give the boys the full tour treatment as they approached Berlin. Francis was almost ready to head back to a pasture near the lead columns when he suddenly pushed the stick forward. He had spotted a motorcyclist with a sidecar speeding out of a road close by some of the 5th's tanks. As he began a dive to check out the vehicle, he glanced to his right and stiffened in amazement. Flying only a few hundred feet above the trees and almost indistinguishable was a Fieseler Storch, a German artillery spotting plane. As the Miss Me drew closer, the white crosses on the fuselage and wings showed prominently against the Storch's grey-black body. Like the Cub, this was a fabric-covered high-wing monoplane, but it was larger than Miss Me and, as Francis knew, at least a good 30 miles an hour faster. The American, however, had the advantage of altitude. Even as Francis yelled, "Let's get him!" he heard Martin urging the same thing. By radio, Martin reported that they had spotted a German plane and announced calmly, "We are about to give combat." On the ground, astounded 5th Armoured tankers, hearing Martin's call, craned their necks skyward, searching out the impending dogfight. Martin got the side doors open as Francis dived. Swinging the Cub into a tight circle over the German plane, both men blasted away with their .45s. Francis hoped the fire would force the German over the waiting tanks where machine gunners could easily bring it down. But the pilot of the enemy plane, though obviously confused by the unexpected attack, was not that obliging. Violently side-slipping, the Storch began circling wildly. Above it, Francis and Martin, like frontier stagecoach guards, were leaning out of their own plane, emptying their automatics as fast as they could pull the triggers. To Francis' amazement, there was no answering fire from the German. Even as the Americans reloaded, the Storch pilot, instead of putting distance between them, kept on circling. Later, Francis could only surmise that the pilot was still trying to figure out what was happening to him. Now, dropping to within 20 feet of the enemy plane, the two Americans put bullet after bullet into the German's windshield. They were so close that Francis saw the pilot staring at us, his eyeballs as big as eggs. Then suddenly, the German manoeuvred wildly and spun in. Martin, who had been giving a rapid running account of the fight on the radio, yelled, "We got him! We got him!" His voice was so blurred with excitement that Lieutenant Colonel Israel Washburn, sitting in his half-track, thought Martin said, "We got hit!" The Storch spiraled down, its right wing hit the ground, snapped off, and the plane cartwheeled and came to rest in the middle of a pasture. Francis set the Miss Me down in the next field and ran across to the downed plane. The German pilot and his observer were already out, but the observer had been hit in the foot and fell to the ground. The pilot dived behind a huge pile of sugar beets until a warning shot from Martin brought him out, hands in the air. As Martin covered the pilot with his gun, Francis examined the wounded observer. When he removed the German's boot, a .45 slug fell out. As he bandaged the superficial wound, the German kept repeating, "Danke, danke, danke." Later that day, Francis and Martin posed happily beside their captured prize. They had fought what was probably the last World War II dogfight in the European theatre, and they were undoubtedly the only airmen in this war to bring down a German plane with a pistol. For Francis, it was a day of pure joy. The only thing that could top this experience would be guiding the 5th Armoured into Berlin. Francis believed he would have only a day or two to wait before the order came. As the platoon of tanks, led by Lieutenant Robert E. Nicodemus, approached Tangermunde at noon, they were met by an ominous silence. The objective of this unit of the 5th Armoured Division was the bridge in the picturesque little city, some 40 miles northeast of Magdeburg. Now that the bridge at Schönebeck was gone, the Tangermunde Bridge was the most important one in the war, to the 9th Army at least. Nicodemus's tank rolled down the main street of Tangermunde and into the square. The streets here, as elsewhere in the city, were deserted. Then, as the tanks pulled up in the square, air raid sirens began to wail, and, Nicodemus said later, "Everything happened at once. All hell broke loose." From windows, doorways and rooftops that had seemed empty moments earlier, Germans opened fire with bazooka-like anti-tank guns. The Americans answered back. At one moment, Sergeant Charles Householder stood in the turret of his tank, blasting away with his Tommy gun until the tank was hit, and he had to jump out. Sergeant Leonard Haymaker's tank, just behind Householder's, was also hit. It burst into flames. Haymaker leapt to safety, but his crewmen were pinned inside by enemy fire. Crouching low and revolving in a slow circle, Haymaker fired short bursts from his Tommy gun, covering his men as they escaped. At the height of the battle, an American soldier jumped on the back of Nicodemus's tank and, shouting above the din, identified himself as an escaped prisoner of war. About 500 prisoners were being held in the town, he said, in 2 separate compounds. Nicodemus found himself in a dilemma. He had been about to call for artillery support, but he could hardly shell a town full of American prisoners. He decided to try breaking into the nearest compound to get the prisoners out of the line of fire. Led by the POW, Nicodemus made his way through buildings and backyards and over fences to an enclosure down by the river. The instant the American prisoners in the compound saw the approaching officer, they jumped their guards. The skirmish was brief. As soon as the guards had been disarmed, Nicodemus led the prisoners out. As the group approached the last enemy-held street and saw American tanks beyond, one GI turned to Nicodemus and exulted, "I'm a free man now. They can't kill me." He walked into the middle of the street and a German sniper shot him through the head. While Nicodemus had been freeing the prisoners, desperate house-to-house fighting had been taking place throughout the city. At last, when the bridge was almost in sight, representatives of the German garrison met the US advance guard and announced their wish to surrender. As the negotiations got underway, there was a tremendous explosion. A huge cloud of dust billowed up, and rubble stormed down on the city. German engineers had blown the bridge. The Victory Division, closest American unit to the capital, had been stopped a tantalizing 53 miles from Berlin. Anxiety began to spread through the 9th Army Command. Up to mid-afternoon of April 12th, there had been every reason for confidence. The 5th Armoured had travelled a phenomenal 200 miles in just 13 days. The 2nd had advanced the same distance in just 1 day more. Altogether, Simpson's army had raced nearly 226 miles since leaving the Rhine. 9th Army divisions were charging up to the Elbe all along the front, but no bridges had yet been seized, no bridgeheads established on the river's eastern bank. Many men had hoped for a repetition of the famous capture of the Rhine Bridge at Remagen, which in early March had changed Anglo-American strategy overnight, but there had been no such luck. Now, at 2nd Armoured Headquarters, a decision was reached. The river must be forced. Troops would make an amphibious assault on the Elbe's eastern bank to secure a bridgehead. Then, a pontoon bridge would be built across the river. At his headquarters, Brigadier General Sidney R. Hines, commander of the 2nd's Combat Command B, laid his plans. The operation would take place south of Magdeburg, at a small town called Westerhusen. At best, the plan was a gamble. Enemy artillery fire might destroy the bridge before its completion, or worse, prevent bridging operations altogether. But the longer Hines waited, the more concentrated the enemy's defences might become. And with each hour of delay, the chance of beating the Russians into Berlin grew slimmer. At 8 p.m. on April 12th, 2 battalions of armoured infantry were quietly ferried across to the eastern bank in the amphibious vehicles known as DUKWs. The crossing was unopposed. By midnight, the 2 battalions were over, and by first light, a third had joined them. On the eastern bank, troops quickly deployed, digging defensive positions in a tight semicircle around the selected pontoon site. Jubilantly, General White put in a telephone call to the 9th Army commander, General Simpson. "We're across!" The Germans learned of the crossing almost as soon as Simpson. At Magdeburg, the combat commander, a veteran of Normandy, immediately got word to General Wenck at 12th Army headquarters. The Magdeburg officer, an expert artilleryman, had long ago learned not to underestimate the enemy. Early on the morning of June 6, 1944, he had looked out from his forward artillery post and had seen the Allied invasion fleet. Then, as now, he had promptly informed his superiors of the situation. "It's the invasion," he had said. "There must be 10,000 ships out there." His incredible message was not believed. "What way are these ships headed?" he was asked. His reply was stark and simple. "Right for me." Now, Major Werner Pluskat, the man who had directed the German fire from the centre of Omaha Beach, prepared to make a stand on the Elbe. His gunners along the river, north and south of Magdeburg, would hold back the Americans as long as they could. But Pluskat had been around too long to have any doubts about the outcome. However, the young cadets on whom General Wenck was depending had no pessimistic thoughts. Eager and fresh, they were looking forward to the battles ahead. Now, mobile combat units of the Potsdam, Scharnhorst and von Hutten divisions were rushing into position, preparing to erase the American bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Elbe. On the west bank of the Elbe, engineers worked frantically. Searchlights, hurriedly positioned, were pointed straight up to reflect off the clouds, and in this artificial moonlight, the first pontoons were secured and pushed into the river. One after another, the floating units were locked in place. Standing close by, Colonel Paul A. Disney, the 67th Armoured Regiment commander, watched the bridging operation with growing impatience. Suddenly, shells screamed in. As they exploded about the first few pontoons, fountains of water shot up in the air. The fire pattern was unusual. The shells did not land in salvos. They came in singly, apparently from several widely positioned guns. Disney, certain that the fire was being directed by an artillery observer hidden nearby, ordered an immediate search of the rundown 4-story apartment houses overlooking the river. The search yielded nothing. The fire continued, accurate and deadly. Ripped pontoons sank, and the shrapnel lashing the water repeatedly forced the bridge builders to take cover. Wounded men were dragged to the safety of the riverbank. Others took their places. All through the night the firing went on, nullifying the grim persistence of the American engineers. The one thing Hines had feared most had happened. Grimly, he ordered an infantry unit on a forced march south. Its instructions: find another site. The following morning, the rest of the bridge was destroyed by German gunfire. When the last shells screamed in and demolished the twisted and battered span, the bridge was only 75 yards from the eastern shore. Heinz, set-faced and weary, ordered the site abandoned. As the men assembled with their wounded, a message arrived. Infantry on the eastern bank had found a suitable bridging area farther down the river. By the afternoon of Friday the 13th, DUKWs were towing a heavy cable across the river to the newest bridgehead. The cable was intended as a stopgap. Once in place, it would haul a string of pontoons back and forth across the river, bearing vehicles, tanks, and guns. Although this system was desperately slow, it would have to serve until bridging materials could be brought up. The matter of greatest concern to Heinz now was the fate of the 3 battalions on the east bank of the river. With their backs to the Elbe, the troops were manning a rough semicircle in the area of the twin villages of Elbenau and Grunewalde. It was a small beachhead, and they had no armour support or artillery except for the batteries on the western banks. If the 3 battalions were hit by any attack in strength, the situation could become perilous. Heinz now ordered Colonel Disney across the Elbe in a DUKW to take command of the infantry. Disney found the first of the 3 battalion command posts, headed by Captain John Finnell, in a patch of woods. Finnell was worried. German pressure was building up. "If we don't get tanks over here real quick," he said, "there's going to be bad trouble." After briefing Heinz on the situation by radio, Disney set out to find the 2nd Battalion. As he moved down near the river, shells began to land all around him. Disney dived into a ditch, but the shells came closer, so he climbed out and started for another one. This time, luck was against him. He felt a rain of shrapnel, then another. A third burst knocked him down. Disney lay there, barely conscious and severely wounded. His left upper arm was gouged and riddled, and a large piece of shrapnel had torn away the upper part of his right thigh. Within 36 hours, Hollingsworth and Disney, 2 of the men most fiercely dedicated to leading American forces to Berlin, had been put out of action. At 1:15 p.m. on April 12th, at about the time lead tanks of the 5th Armoured Division were rolling into Tangermünde, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died at his desk in Warm Springs. An artist was working on a portrait of him when, suddenly, the president put a hand to his head and complained of a headache. A short while later, he was dead. On his desk lay a copy of the Atlanta Constitution. The headline read, "9th, 57 miles from Berlin." It was nearly 24 hours later before news of the president's death began filtering down to the frontline troops. Major Alcee Peters of the 84th Division heard the news from a German. At a railroad crossing near Varenholz, an aging flagman came up to offer him sympathy because "the news is so terrible." Peters felt shock and disbelief, but before he fully absorbed what he had heard, his column moved out again, heading for the Elbe, and he had other matters to think about. Lieutenant Colonel Norman Carnes, commanding a battalion of the 333rd Infantry Regiment, was travelling through a bombed-out oil field north of Brunswick when he learned of FDR's death. He felt regret, but his mind, too, was on his work. "It was just another crisis," he later said. "My next objective was Wittingen, and I was busy thinking about that. Roosevelt, dead or alive, couldn't help me now." Chaplain Ben Rose wrote to his wife Anne, "All of us were sorry, but we've seen so many men die that most of us know that even Roosevelt is not indispensable. I was surprised how calmly we heard the news and talked about it." Joseph Goebbels could scarcely contain himself. The moment he heard the news, he telephoned Hitler in the Führer bunker. "My Führer, I congratulate you. Roosevelt is dead," he exulted. "It is written in the stars. The last half of April will be the turning point for us. This is Friday, April 13th. It is the turning point." Sometime earlier, Goebbels had passed along 2 astrological predictions to Count Schwerin von Krosigk, Reichsminister of Finance. One had been prepared for Hitler the day he took power, January 30th, 1933. The other, dated November 9th, 1918, had dealt with the future of the Weimar Republic. Krosigk noted in his diary, An amazing fact had become evident. Both horoscopes predicted the outbreak of war in 1939, the victories until 1941, and the subsequent series of reversals, with the hardest blows during the first months of 1945, especially in the first half of April. Then there was to be an overwhelming victory in the second half of April, stagnation until August, and peace the same month. For the following 3 years, Germany would have a difficult time, but starting in 1948, she would rise again. Goebbels also had been reading Thomas Carlyle's History of Friedrich II of Prussia, and it had given him further cause for delight. One chapter told of the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, when Prussia had stood alone against a coalition of forces that included France, Austria, and Russia. In the 6th year of this struggle, Frederick had told his advisers that if by February 15th there was no change in his fortunes, he would commit suicide. Then on January 5th, 1762, Tsarina Elizabeth died, and Russia withdrew from the conflict. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg, wrote Carlyle, had come to pass. The whole character of the war had changed for the better. Now, in the 6th year of World War II, Roosevelt was dead. The parallel was inescapable. The propaganda minister was in ecstasy. At the Ministry of Propaganda, he ordered champagne for everyone. "Get across! Get across! And keep moving!" Colonel Edwin Buckshot Craybill of the 83rd Division stalked up and down the riverbank, pushing men into assault boats and, here and there, helping slow starters with the toe of his boot. "Don't waste this opportunity!" he yelled at another boatload. "You're on your way to Berlin!" As other men began to move across in DUKWs, the short, peppery Craybill admonished them, "Don't wait to organise. Don't wait for someone to tell you what to do. Get over there in any shape you can. If you move now, you can make it without a shot being fired." Craybill was right. At the town of Barbie, 15 miles southeast of Magdeburg and just below the spot where their arch-rivals, the 2nd Armoured, were desperately trying to make use of their cable ferry, the men of the 83rd were crossing the river in droves, unopposed. They had entered the town to find that the bridge had been blown, but without waiting for orders from the 83rd's commanding officer, Craybill had ordered an immediate crossing. Assault boats had been rushed up, and in a matter of hours a full battalion had been put across. Now another was en route. Simultaneously, artillery was being floated over on pontoons, and engineers were building a treadway bridge that should be finished by nightfall. Even Craybill was impressed by the frenetic activity his orders had set off. As he dashed from group to group, urging more speed, he kept repeating triumphantly to the other officers, "They'll never believe this back at Fort Benning." Watching the feverish scene in silence was an audience of Germans standing on a balcony below the clock tower of the town hall. For hours, as Lieutenant Colonel Granville Sharp, commanding an infantry battalion, cleaned up what little resistance there was in the town, he had been aware of the audience, and he had grown increasingly annoyed. "My men were being shot at, but there stood the Germans watching the fighting and the river assault with intense interest," he recalled. Now Sharp had had enough. Going up to a tank, he told the gunner, "Put one round through the clock face at, say, about 5 o'clock. The tanker obliged, scoring a clean bullseye on the number 5. The gallery suddenly dispersed. In any case, the show was over. The 83rd was across. The first solid bridgehead had been established on the east bank of the Elbe. By the evening of the 13th, engineers had finished their task, and, thorough to the end, had put up a sign on the approach to the bridge. In honour of the new president, and, with the division's customary high morale and keen appreciation for the value of advertising, it read, The news was flashed back to General Simpson, and from there to General Bradley. He immediately telephoned Eisenhower. Suddenly the 83rd's bridgehead was uppermost in everybody's thoughts. The Supreme Commander listened carefully to the news. Then, at the end of the report, he put a question to Bradley. As Bradley later reconstructed the conversation, Eisenhower asked, "Brad, what do you think it might cost us to break through from the Elbe and take Berlin?" Bradley had been considering that same question for days. Like Eisenhower, He did not now see Berlin as a military objective, but if it could be taken easily, he was for its capture. Still, Bradley, like his chief, was concerned about too deep a penetration into the future Soviet zone and about the casualties that would occur as US troops moved forward into areas from which, eventually, they would have to withdraw. He did not believe losses on the way to Berlin would be too high, but it might be a different story in the city itself. Taking Berlin might be costly. Now he answered the Supreme Commander, "I estimate that it might cost us 100,000 men." There was a pause. Then Bradley added, "It would be a pretty stiff price to pay for a prestige objective, especially when we know that we've got to pull back and let the other fellow take over." There the conversation ended. The Supreme Commander did not reveal his intentions, but Bradley had made his own opinion unmistakably clear. US lives were more important than mere prestige or the temporary occupation of meaningless real estate. At headquarters of the 19th Corps, General McLean stood before his map studying the situation. In his opinion, the enemy line on the eastern bank of the Elbe was a hard crust, nothing more. Once his divisions got across and broke through it, nothing would stop them from rolling into Berlin. Colonel George B. Sloan, McLean's operations officer, believed the Americans would hit the same sort of opposition they had encountered en route from the Rhine, pockets of last-ditch resistance that could be bypassed by fast-moving forces. He had every confidence that within 48 hours of resuming the attack, leading elements of US armoured units would enter Berlin. McLean made a few quick decisions. The surprising accomplishment of the ragtag circus in grabbing a bridgehead, rushing troops across and then straddling the Elbe with a bridge, all within a few hours, had changed the whole river picture. The men of the 83rd were not merely expanding the beachhead on the eastern bank, they were advancing out of it. McLean was sure that the 83rd's bridgehead was permanent. He was not so sure that the 2nd Armoured's puny cable ferry operation would survive the shelling. Still, the 2nd had 3 battalions across, and they were holding. Arrangements had been made for part of the 2nd Armoured to begin crossing the 83rd's Truman Bridge. McLean, therefore, saw no reason for the 30th Division, now moving into position, to attack Magdeburg and go for the Autobahn Bridge. At the rate the troops were moving now, the 83rd's bridgehead could be quickly expanded to link with the cut-off battalions opposite the 2nd's cable ferry site. From this vastly enlarged bridgehead, the drive could continue. McLean decided to bypass Magdeburg entirely. The Truman Bridge, as the 83rd had anticipated, would be the gateway to Berlin. At dawn, Saturday, April 14th, at the 2nd Armoured's cable ferry, General Heinz waited for the 3 pontoons to be strapped together. They would form the ferry platform which the cable would pull back and forth pending construction of a bridge. Shells were still falling about both banks of the bridgehead, and troops on the eastern side were involved in heavy fighting. They could hold out for some time against opposing infantry, but Heinz's great fear was of a panzer attack. The Americans on the east bank were still without supporting artillery or armour. The first vehicle to roll onto the pontoon ferry was a bulldozer. The eastern bank of the river had to be scraped and graded before tanks and heavy weapons could climb it. A Duke AW would tow the platform, speeding the ferry by helping the cable move faster. Heinz watched anxiously. 2 cables had been damaged and washed downstream. He had only one left, and his last outsized pontoons had gone to make the ferry. The cumbersome operation began. As men watched, the ferry moved slowly out into the middle of the Elbe. Then, as it neared the eastern shore, the unbelievable happened. A single shell screamed in, and in a 1,000,000-to-1 shot severed the cable. Heinz stood frozen in shock as cable, ferry and bulldozer disappeared down the river. Bitterly he said, "There it goes to hell!" As though the incredible bullseye had been a signal for total disaster, word now came that the troops on the eastern bank were being attacked by armoured vehicles. On the eastern side of the Elbe, through the wisps of morning haze and the smoke from artillery fire, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Anderson watched the German armour smashing through his infantry defence lines. There were 7 or 8 armoured vehicles, among them a couple of tanks. Through his glasses, Anderson saw the group, well out of range of his own anti-tank bazookas, firing methodically into the American foxholes. Even as he watched, one of his companies holding positions on the far right of his command post was overrun. Troops dashed from their foxholes, making for the safety of the woods. Now the Germans were working over the positions of Anderson's other two companies, blasting the foxholes one by one. Frantically, Anderson radioed the batteries on the Elbe's western bank for help, but the attack had taken place so fast that even as the second armoured's shells came screaming in, Anderson knew they were too late. Farther along the bridgehead, Lieutenant Bill Parkins, commanding I Company, suddenly heard his machine guns open up, and then the answering fire of German burp guns. A platoon runner dashed up. 3 German vehicles with infantry, he reported, were coming down along the line, cleaning out everything as they go. Parkins sent back word to the troops to remain in position and to keep firing. Then he dashed out of his command post to find out for himself what was happening. "I saw 3 Mark V tanks about 100 yards away, approaching from the east," he later reported, "and each one appeared to have a platoon of infantry with it. They had American prisoners marching in front. Their guns were firing right through them." Some of Parkins's men returned the fire with their bazookas, but the range was too great. Those projectiles that hit merely ricocheted off the tanks. His men were being chewed up. Parkins ordered them to pull back before they were all captured or killed. From north, east, and south of the bridgehead, German vehicles came in fast. Staff Sergeant Wilfred Kramer, in charge of an infantry platoon, saw a German tank about 220 yards away. Infantry was fanned out about it and coming up behind. Kramer ordered his men to wait. Then, when the Germans were about 40 yards away, he yelled to open fire. "We were doing all right and holding our own," he later explained. But then the tank opened up. The first round landed about 10 yards from our machine gun. Then Jerry went right down the line. He could see where every one of our holes was. It was point-blank fire. Kramer held out for as long as he dared. Then he too ordered his men back. The fighting was so fierce around Grunewalde that Lieutenant Colonel Carlton E. Stewart, commanding a battalion, got a call for artillery from one of his companies and was told to throw it right on our positions as our men are in the cellars of the houses. Everyone was asking for airstrikes to knock out the tanks, but only a few planes showed up during the entire dawn-to-noon battle. In the dash to the Elbe, fighter strips had been left so far. Ambitious and eager for glory, they had pushed themselves and their meagre equipment to the limit, buying the time Wenck needed. In throwing back the 2nd Armoured Division, these mobile shock troops had accomplished something no other German unit had managed in 30 months of combat. Had the division been able to secure either a bridge or a bridgehead across the Elbe, the 2nd might have roared right on to Berlin without ever waiting for orders. The Supreme Commander's plan of attack on Germany had unfolded brilliantly. Indeed, the speed of the great Anglo-American advance had clearly surprised even him. In the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was moving steadily. The Canadians, closing on Arnhem, were ready to begin clearing out the big enemy pocket that remained in northeast Holland. The British Second Army had crossed the river line, captured the town of Celle, and was on the outskirts of Bremen. In the centre of the Reich, the surrounded Ruhr was almost reduced and, most important, Simpson's Ninth Army, along with the US First and Third Armies, had almost cut Germany in two. The first was advancing on Leipzig, while Patton's Third was nearing the Czech border. But these whirlwind gains had taken a toll. They had stretched Eisenhower's supply lines almost to the limit. Apart from truck convoys, there was virtually no land transport available to Bradley's forces. Only one railroad bridge was still in operation over the Rhine. The fighting forces remained well supplied, but Scheiff's staff officers were disturbed by the total picture. To serve the far-flung armies, hundreds of troop carrier command planes had been ordered to fly around the clock, bringing up supplies. On April 5th alone, a flying train of C-47S had carried more than 3,500 tons of ammunition and supplies, and almost 750,000 gallons of gasoline to the front. Additionally, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, they had to supply increasing numbers of non-combatants. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war had to be fed. Forced labourers from various countries and liberated British and American POWs needed shelter, food, and medical services. Hospitals, ambulance convoys, and medical supplies were only now moving up. Although these medical facilities were vast, an unforeseen demand was suddenly thrust upon them. In recent days, what would prove to be the greatest hidden horror of the Third Reich began to be uncovered. All along the front, in this tremendous week of advance, men had recoiled in shock and revulsion as they encountered Hitler's concentration camps, their hundreds of thousands of inmates, and the evidence of their millions of dead. Battle-hardened soldiers could scarcely believe what they were seeing as scores of camps and prisons fell into their hands. 20 years later, men would remember those scenes with grim anger, the emaciated walking skeletons who tottered toward them, their will to survive the only possession they had saved from the Nazi regime, the mass graves, pits and trenches, the lines of crematoriums filled with charred bones, mute and awful testimony to the systematic mass extermination of political prisoners, who had been put to death, as one Buchenwald guard explained, because they were only Jews. Troops found gas chambers, set up like shower rooms, except that cyanide gas instead of water sprayed from the nozzles. In the Buchenwald commandant's home, there were lampshades made from human skin. The commandant's wife, Ilse Koch, had book covers and gloves made from the flesh of inmates. 2 human heads, shrunken and stuffed, were displayed on small wooden stands. There were warehouses full of shoes, clothing, artificial limbs, dentures and eyeglasses, sorted and numbered with detached and methodical efficiency. Gold had been removed from the dentures and forwarded to the Reich Finance Ministry. How many had been exterminated? In the first shock of discovery, no one could even estimate. But it was clear, as reports came in from all along the front, that the total would be astronomical. As to who the victims were, that was only too obvious. They were, by the Third Reich's definition, the non-Aryans, the culture-tainting inferiors, peoples of a dozen nations and of a dozen faiths, but predominantly Jews. Among them were Poles, Frenchmen, Czechs, Dutchmen, Norwegians, Russians and Germans. In history's most diabolical mass murder, they had been slain in a variety of unnatural ways. Some were used as guinea pigs in laboratory experiments. Thousands were shot, poisoned, hanged or gassed. Others were simply allowed to starve to death. In the camp at Ohrdruf, overrun by the U.S. Third Army on April 12th, General George S. Patton, one of the U.S. Army's most hard-bitten officers, walked through the death houses, then turned away, his face wet with tears, and was uncontrollably ill. The next day, Patton ordered the population of a nearby village, whose inhabitants claimed ignorance of the situation within the camp, to view it for themselves. Those who hung back were escorted at rifle point. The following morning, the mayor of the village and his wife hanged themselves. Along the British route of advance, the discoveries were equally terrible. Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, the British Second Army's senior medical officer, had been worrying for days about the possibility of infectious diseases in a camp he had been warned about at a place called Belsen. Upon arrival, Hughes discovered that typhus and typhoid were the least of his worries. "No photograph, no description could bring home the horrors I saw," he said years later. There were 56,000 people still alive in the camp. They were living in 45 huts. There were anywhere from 600 to 1,000 people living in accommodations that could take barely 100. The huts overflowed with inmates in every state of emaciation and disease. They were suffering from starvation, gastroenteritis, typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis. There were dead everywhere, some in the same bunks as the living. Lying in the compounds, in uncovered mass graves, in trenches, in the gutters, by the side of the barbed wire surrounding the camp and by the huts, were some 10,000 more. In my 30 years as a doctor, I had never seen anything like it. To save those still living, armies all along the front had to get immediate medical help. In some instances, military needs had to take second place. "I do not believe," Hughes later said, "that anyone realized what we were going to be faced with, or the demands that would be made on the medical services. Doctors, nurses, hospital beds, and thousands of tons of medical stores and equipment were urgently needed. Brigadier Hughes alone required a 14,000-bed hospital, even though he knew that no matter what steps were taken, at least 500 inmates would die each day until the situation could be brought under control. General Eisenhower made a personal tour of a camp near Gotha. Ashen-faced, his teeth clenched, he walked through every part of the camp. Up to that moment, he later recalled, I had known about it only generally or through secondary sources. I have never at any other time experienced an equal sense of shock. The psychological effect of the camps on officers and men was beyond assessment. On the 9th Army front, in a village near Magdeburg, Major Julius Rock, a medical officer with the 30th Infantry, came up to inspect a freight train which the 30th had stopped. It was loaded with concentration camp inmates. Rock, horrified, immediately unloaded the train. Over the local burgomaster's vehement protests, Rock billeted the inmates in German homes, but not until his battalion commander had given a crisp command to the complaining burgomaster. "If you refuse," he said simply, "I'll take hostages and shoot them." A cold determination to win and win quickly was replacing every other emotion in the men who had seen concentration camps. The Supreme Commander felt much the same way. On his return to Schaeff from Gotha, he wired Washington and London urging that editors and legislators be sent immediately to Germany to see the horror camps at first hand, so that the evidence could be placed before the American and British publics in a fashion that would leave no room for cynical doubt. But before Eisenhower could press on to end the war, he had to consolidate his far-flung forces. On the night of the 14th, from his office in Reims, Eisenhower cabled Washington of his future plans. Having successfully completed his thrust in the center, Eisenhower said, he was confronted by two main tasks: the further subdivision of the enemy's remaining forces, and the capture of those areas where he might form a last stand effectively. Those latter places, Eisenhower thought, would be Norway and the national redoubt of Bavaria. In the north, he planned to throw Montgomery's forces forward across the Elbe to secure Hamburg and drive for Lübeck and Kiel. In the south, he planned to send General Devers's 6th Army Group toward the Salzburg area. Operations in the winter, Eisenhower stated, would be extremely difficult in the National Redoubt. The National Redoubt could remain in being even after we join the Russians, so we must move rapidly before the Germans have the opportunity to thoroughly prepare its defences with men and material. As for the German capital, Eisenhower thought it would also be most desirable to make a thrust to Berlin, as the enemy may group forces around his capital, and, in any event, its fall would greatly affect the morale of the enemy and that of our own peoples. But, said the Supreme Commander, that operation must take a low priority in point of time, unless operations to clear our flanks proceed with unexpected rapidity. In brief, then, his plan was to hold a firm front in the central area on the Elbe, to begin operations toward Lübeck and Denmark, to initiate a powerful thrust to meet Soviet troops in the Danube Valley and break up the National Redoubt. Since the thrust on Berlin must await the outcome of the first three above, Eisenhower said, I do not include it as a part of my plan. On the Elbe, all through the night of the 14th, men of the Ragtag Circus and the 2nd Armoured moved across the 83rd's bridges at Barbie. Although a second bridge had been built near the first, the movement across remained slow. General White's armoured column, however, planned to begin the Berlin drive again the moment it reassembled on the western bank. Among the troops of the 83rd, the story was going around that Colonel Krebel had offered to lend the 2nd Armoured a large, newly confiscated red bus, capable of holding 50 soldiers, which he had liberated in Barbie. The 83rd had every reason to feel triumphant. Already its patrols were north of the town of Zerbst, less than 48 miles from Berlin. Early Sunday morning, April 15th, the 9th Army commander, General Simpson, received a call from General Bradley. Simpson was to fly immediately to the 12th Army Group headquarters at Wiesbaden. "I've something very important to tell you," Bradley said, "and I don't want to say it on the phone." Bradley was waiting for his commander at the airfield. We shook hands, Simpson recalled, and there and then he told me the news. Brad said, "You must stop on the Elbe. You are not to advance any farther in the direction of Berlin. I'm sorry, Simp, but there it is." "Where in the hell did you get this?" Simpson demanded. "From Ike," Bradley said. Simpson was so stunned he could not even remember half of the things Brad said from then on. "All I remember is that I was heartbroken, and I got back on the plane in a kind of a daze. All I could think of was, how am I going to tell my staff, my corps commanders, and my troops? Above all, how am I going to tell my troops?" From his headquarters, Simpson passed the word along to his corps commanders. Then he left immediately for the Elbe. General Hines encountered Simpson at the Second's headquarters and, seeing him, became worried. "I thought," Hines recalled, "that maybe the old man didn't like the way we were crossing the river. He asked how I was getting along." Hines answered, "I guess we're all right now, General. We had 2 good withdrawals. There was no excitement and no panic, and our Barbie crossings are going well." "Fine," said Simpson. "Keep some of your men on the east bank if you want to, but they're not to go any farther." He looked at Hines. "Sid," he said, "this is as far as we're going." Hines was shocked into insubordination. "No, sir," he said promptly. "That's not right. We're going to Berlin." Simpson seemed to struggle to control his emotions. There was a moment of uneasy silence. Then Simpson said in a flat, dead voice, "We're not going to Berlin, Sid. This is the end of the war for us. Between Barleben and Magdeburg, where elements of the 30th Division troops were still advancing toward the river, the news spread quickly. Men gathered in groups, gesturing and talking both angrily and excitedly. PFC Alexander Korolovich of the 120th Regiment, Company D, took no part in the conversation. He wasn't sure if he was sad or happy, but he simply sat down and cried. Heinrici recognized all the signs. At one part of the front, the Russians had laid down a short artillery barrage. In another section, they had launched a small attack. These were feints, and Heinrici knew it. He had learned all the Russian ruses years before. These small actions were the prelude to the main attack. Now his main concern was how soon he should order his men back to the second line of defence. While he was pondering the question, Reichsminister Albert Speer, the armament and production chief, arrived. This was one day Heinrici did not want visitors, especially someone as nervous and obviously harassed as Speer. In the confines of Heinrici's office, Speer explained the nature of his visit. He wanted the general's support. Heinrici must not follow Hitler's scorched earth orders to destroy German industry, power plants, bridges, and the like. "Why?" Speer asked. "Should everything be destroyed with Germany, even now defeated? The German people must survive." Heinrici heard him out. He agreed that the Hitler order was vicious, he told Speer, and he would do everything in his power to help. "But," cautioned Heinrici, "all I can do right now is to try and fight this battle as well as I can." Suddenly, Speer pulled a pistol out of his pocket. "The only way to stop Hitler," he said suddenly, "is with something like this." Heinrici looked at the gun, his eyebrows raised. "Well," he said coldly, "I must tell you that I was not born to murder." Speer paced the office. He seemed not even to have heard Heinrici. "It is absolutely impossible to make it clear to Hitler that he should give up," he said. "I have tried 3 times, in October 1944, in January, and in March of this year. Hitler's reply to me on the last occasion was this: if a soldier had talked to me this way, I would consider he had lost his nerve and I would order him shot. Then he said, in this serious crisis, leaders must not lose their nerves. If they do, they should be done away with. It is impossible to persuade him that everything is lost. Impossible." Speer put the pistol back in his pocket. "It would be impossible to kill him anyway," he said in a calmer voice. He did not tell Heinrici that for months he had been thinking of assassinating Hitler and his entire court. He had even thought up a scheme to introduce gas into the ventilating system of the Führer bunker, but it had proved impossible, A 12-foot-high chimney had been built around the air intake pipe. Now Speer said, "I could kill him if I thought I could help the German people, but I can't." He looked at Heinrici. "Hitler has always believed in me," he said. Then he added, "Anyway, it would somehow be indecent." Heinrici did not like the tone of the conversation. He was also worried about Speer's manner and inconsistencies. If it ever became known that Speer had talked to him this way, everyone at his headquarters would probably be shot. Heinrici deftly brought the conversation back to the original subject, the protection of Germany from the scorched earth policy. "All I can do," the Vistula commander reiterated, "is to perform my duty as a soldier as well as I can. The rest lies in the hands of God. I will assure you of this. Berlin will not become a Stalingrad. I will not let that happen." The fighting in Stalingrad had been street by street, block by block. Heinrici had no intention of letting his troops fall back to Berlin under Russian pressure and there fight a similar kind of battle. As for Hitler's instructions to destroy vital installations throughout his army group area, Heinrici had already privately countermanded that order. He told Speer that he expected the Berlin commandant, General Rehmann, momentarily. He had invited Rehmann, Heinrici said, to discuss these very matters, and to explain personally why it was impossible to take the Berlin garrison under the Vistula command. A few moments later, Rehmann arrived. With him was Heinrici's chief of operations, Colonel Eismann. Speer remained throughout the military conference. Heinrici told Rehmann, as Eismann was later to note, not to depend on the Vistula army group for support. Rehmann looked as though his last hope was gone. "I do not know then," he said, "how I can defend Berlin." Heinrici expressed the hope that his forces could bypass Berlin. "Of course," he added, "I may be ordered to send units into Berlin, but you should not depend on it." Rehmann told Heinrici that he had received orders from Hitler to destroy bridges and certain buildings in the city. Heinrici replied angrily, "Any demolition of bridges or anything else in Berlin will merely paralyze the city. If by any chance I am ordered to include Berlin in my command, I will forbid such demolitions." Speer added his weight to the discussion, begging Rehmann not to carry out the orders. In such a case, he said, most of the city would be cut off from water and electric supplies. As Eismann recalled Speer's words, he said, "If you destroy these supply lines, the city will be paralyzed for at least a year. It will lead to epidemic and hunger for millions. It's your duty to prevent this catastrophe. It's your responsibility not to carry out these orders." The atmosphere, as Eismann remembered, was charged with tension. A hard struggle was going on within Rehmann, he said. Finally, he answered in a hoarse voice that he had done his duty as an officer in an honourable manner. His son had fallen at the front. His home and possessions were gone. All he had left was his honour. He reminded us of what had happened to the officer who failed to blow up the Remagen bridge. He had been executed like a common criminal. The same, Rehmann thought, would happen to him if he did not carry out his orders. Both Heinrici and Speer tried to dissuade him, but they could not change his mind. At last, Rehmann took his leave. Shortly thereafter, Speer drove away too. Finally, Heinrici was alone, to concentrate on the one thing uppermost in his mind, the timing of the Russian attack. The latest batch of intelligence reports had arrived at headquarters, and they seemed to point to an immediate assault. General Reinhard Gehlen, OKH Chief of Intelligence, had even included the most recent prisoner interrogations. One report told of a Red Army soldier from the 49th Rifle Division who stated that the major offensive operation will begin in about 5 to 10 days. There was talk, the prisoner had said, among Soviet soldiers that Russia will not allow the US and England to claim the conquest of Berlin. A second report was similar and contained even more speculation. A prisoner of the 79th Corps taken earlier in the day near Kustrin said that when the attack began, its main purpose would be to get to Berlin ahead of the Americans. According to the soldier, brushes were expected with the Americans, who would be covered by mistake with artillery fire, so that they will feel the force of Russian artillery. In Moscow, on this same day, Sunday, April 15th, Ambassador Averell Harriman met with Stalin to discuss the war in the Far East. Prior to the meeting, General Dean of the U.S. military mission had drawn Harriman's attention to German radio reports, which stated that the Russians were expected to attack Berlin at any moment. Harriman, as the conference with Stalin ended, casually brought up the matter. Was it true, he asked, that the Red Army was about to renew its offensive on Berlin? The Marshal's answer, as General Dean was to cable Washington that evening, was, "Stalin said there was indeed going to be an offensive, and that he did not know if it would be successful. However, the main blow of this attack would be aimed toward Dresden, not Berlin, as he had already told Eisenhower." Then, a little after 8 p.m., he made a decision. He had analysed all the reports from the field. He had assessed and evaluated every nuance of his old enemy's moves. Now, as he walked the length of his office, hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in concentration, he paused. To an intently watching aide, it was as though he had suddenly sniffed the very air. He turned to his staff. "I believe," he said quietly, "the attack will take place in the early hours tomorrow." Beckoning to his chief of staff, he issued a one-line order to General Buss, commanding the German Ninth Army. It read, "Move back and take up positions on the second line of defence." The time was now 8:45 p.m. In exactly 7 hours and 15 minutes, on Monday, April 16th, the Giftswerk would begin to fight Germany's last battle. France's extraordinary feat, unequalled in World War II, has never been acknowledged by the U.S. Defense Department. He was recommended for a Distinguished Flying Cross, but never received it. Curiously, Martin, though not a flyer, was awarded the Air Medal for his part in the action. Bradley's estimate has given rise to much confusion, both as to when he gave it to Eisenhower and as to how he arrived at the figure. The incident was first revealed by Bradley himself in his memoir, A Soldier's Story. No date was given. Thus, as Bradley has told the author, he is partly responsible for the uncertainty that resulted. One version that has seen print depicts Bradley as telling Eisenhower at Schaeff, as early as January 1945, that the Berlin casualty figure would reach 100,000. Bradley himself says, "I gave the estimate to Ike on the phone immediately after we got the Elbe bridgehead. Certainly I did not expect to suffer 100,000 casualties driving from there to Berlin, but I was convinced that the Germans would fight hard for their capital. It was in Berlin, as I saw it, that we would have suffered the greatest losses." In the deep darkness of the forests, there was complete silence. Beneath the pines and camouflage netting, the guns were lined up for mile after mile and stepped back calibre by calibre. The mortars were in front. Behind them were tanks, their long rifles elevated. Next came self-propelled guns and, following these, batteries of light and heavy artillery. Along the rear were 400 Katushkas, multi-barreled rocket launchers capable of firing 16 projectiles simultaneously. And massed in the Kustrin bridgehead on the Oder's western bank were the searchlights. Everywhere now, in these last few minutes before the attack, the men of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's armies waited for 0 hour, 4 a.m. Captain Sergei Golubov's mouth was dry. With each passing moment, it seemed to him that the stillness was becoming more intense. He was with troops north of Kustrin on the eastern bank of the Oder, at a point where the flooded river was almost 500 yards wide. Around him, he would later relate, were swarms of assault troops, lines of tanks, platoons of engineers with sections of pontoon bridges and rubber boats. Everywhere the bank of the river was jammed with men and equipment, and yet there was complete silence. Golubov could sense the soldiers almost trembling with excitement, like horses trembling before the hunt. He kept telling himself that, somehow I had to survive this day, for there was so much I had to write. Over and over he kept repeating, "This is no time to die." In the centre, troops were jammed into the bridgehead on the river's western bank. This key lodgment, it was now 30 miles long and 10 miles deep, which the Russians had wrested from General Buss in late March, was to be the springboard for Zhukov's drive on Berlin. From here, the men of the crack 8th Guards Army would launch the assault. Once they seized the critical Silo Heights directly ahead and slightly to the west, the armour would follow. Guards Lieutenant Vladimir Rozanov, a 21-year-old leader of an artillery reconnaissance section, stood on the west bank near the bed army girls who would operate the searchlights. Rozanov was sure that the lights would drive the Germans mad. He could hardly wait for the girls to switch them on. In one respect, however, Rozanov was unusually concerned about the forthcoming attack. His father was with Marshal Koniev's forces to the south. The young officer was angry with his father. The older man had not written the family in 2 years. Nevertheless, he had high hopes that they might meet in Berlin and perhaps go home together after the battle. Although he was fed up with the war, Rozanov was glad to be on hand for the last great assault, but the waiting was almost unbearable. Farther along the bridgehead, Gun Crew Chief Sergeant Nikolai Svishchev stood by his battery. A veteran of many artillery barrages, he knew what to expect. At the moment the firing began, he had warned his crew, "Roar at the top of your voices to equalize the pressure, for the noise will be terrific." Now, gun lanyard in hand, Svishchev awaited the signal to open fire. South of Kustrin, in the bridgehead around Frankfurt, Sergeant Nikolai Novikov of a rifle regiment was reading the slogans scrawled on the sides of nearby tanks. "Moscow to Berlin," read one. Another said, "50 kilometers to the lair of the fascist beast." Novikov was in a frenzy of excitement. His enthusiasm had been whetted by a morale-building speech given by one of the regiment's political officers. The impassioned and optimistic pep talk had so stirred Novikov that he had promptly signed an application to join the Communist Party. In a bunker built into a hill overlooking the Kustrin bridgehead, Marshal Zhukov stood gazing impassively into the darkness. With him was Colonel General Chuikov, the defender of Stalingrad and commander of the spearhead 8th Guards Army. Ever since Stalingrad, Chuikov had suffered from eczema. The rash had particularly affected his hands. To protect them, he wore black gloves. Now, as he waited impatiently for the offensive to begin, he nervously rubbed one gloved hand against the other. "Vasily Ivanovich," Zhukov suddenly asked, "are all your battalions in position?" Chuikov's answer was quick and assured. "For the last 48 hours, Comrade Marshal," he said. "Everything you have ordered, I have done." Zhukov looked at his watch. Settling himself at the bunker's aperture, he tilted back his cap, rested both elbows on the concrete ledge, and carefully adjusted his field glasses. Chuikov turned up the collar of his greatcoat, and, pulling the flaps of his fur cap over his ears to muffle the sound of the bombardment, took up a position beside Zhukov and sighted his own binoculars. Staff officers clustered behind them or left the bunker to watch from the hill outside. Now everyone gazed silently into the darkness. Zhukov glanced once more at his watch and again looked through the glasses. The seconds ticked away. Then Zhukov said quietly, "Now, comrades, now." It was 4 a.m. 3 red flares soared up suddenly into the night sky. For one interminable moment the lights hung in mid-air, bathing the Oder in a garish crimson. Then, in the Kustrin bridgehead, Zhukov's phalanx of searchlights flashed on. With blinding intensity, the 140 huge anti-aircraft lights, supplemented by the lights of tanks, trucks and other vehicles, focused directly ahead on the German positions. The dazzling glare reminded war correspondent Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Troyanovsky of 1,000 suns joined together. Colonel General Mikhail Katukov, commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, was taken completely by surprise. "Where the hell did we get all the searchlights?" he asked Lieutenant General Enon Popiel of Zhukov's staff. "The devil only knows," Popiel replied, "but I think they stripped the entire Moscow anti-aircraft defense zone." For just a moment there was silence as the searchlights illuminated the area ahead of Kustrin. Then 3 green flares soared into the heavens, and Zhukov's guns spoke. With an ear-splitting, earth-shaking roar, the front erupted in flame. In a bombardment that had never been equalled on the Eastern Front, more than 20,000 guns of all calibers poured a storm of fire onto the German positions. Pinned in the merciless glare of the searchlights, the German countryside beyond the western Kustrin bridgehead seemed to disappear before a rolling wall of bursting shells. Whole villages disintegrated. Earth, concrete, steel, and parts of trees spewed into the air, and in the distance, forests began to blaze. To the north and south of Kustrin, thousands of gun flashes stabbed the darkness. Pinpoints of light, like deadly firecrackers, winked in rapid succession as tons of shells slammed into targets. The hurricane of explosives was so intense that an atmospheric disturbance was created. Years later, German survivors would vividly recall the strange hot wind that suddenly sprang up and howled through the forests, bending saplings and whipping dust and debris into the air. And men on both sides of the line would never forget the violent thunder of the guns. They created a concussion so tremendous that troops and equipment alike shook uncontrollably from the shock. The storm of sound was stupefying. At Sergeant Svischev's battery, the gunners yelled at the tops of their voices, but the concussion of their guns was so great that blood ran from their ears. The most fearsome sound of all came from the katushkas, or Stalin organs, as the troops called them. The rocket projectiles whooshed off the launchers in fiery batches and screeched through the night, leaving long white trails behind them. The terrifying noise they made reminded Captain Golbov of huge blocks of steel grinding together. Despite the terrible racket, Golbov found the bombardment exhilarating. All around him he saw troops cheering as though they were fighting the Germans hand to hand, and everywhere men were firing whatever weapon they had, even though they could see no target. As he watched the guns belching flames, he remembered some words his grandmother had once uttered about the end of the world, when the earth would burn and the bad ones would be devoured by fire. Amid the tumult of the bombardment, Zhukov's troops began to move out. Chuikov's well-disciplined 8th Guards led the way from the Kustrin bridgehead on the Oder's western banks. As they surged forward, the artillery barrage remained always in front of them, carpeting the area ahead. North and south of Kustrin, where assault crossings had to be made across the flooded river, engineers were in the water laying pontoons and fitting together prefabricated sections of wooden bridges. All around them, waves of shock troops were crossing the Oder without waiting for the bridges, tossing and bobbing in a variety of assault boats. In the ranks were troops who had stood at Leningrad, Smolensk, Stalingrad, and before Moscow, men who had fought their way across half a continent to reach the Oder. There were soldiers who had seen their villages and towns obliterated by German guns, their crops burned, and their families slain by German soldiers. For all these, the assault had special meaning. They had lived for this moment of revenge. The Germans had left them nothing at home to return to. They had nowhere to go but forward. Now they attacked savagely. Equally avid were the thousands of recently released prisoners of war. Reinforcements had been so urgently needed by the Red Army that the newly freed prisoners, tattered, emaciated, many still showing the effects of brutal treatment, had been given arms. Now they, too, rushed forward, seeking a terrible vengeance. Cheering and yelling like wild tribesmen, the Russian troops advanced on the Oder's eastern banks. Caught up in a kind of frenzy, they found it impossible to wait for boats or bridges. Golbov watched in amazement as soldiers dived in, fully equipped, and began swimming the river. Others floated across clutching empty gasoline cans, planks, blocks of wood, tree trunks, anything that would float. It was a fantastic spectacle. It reminded Golbov of a huge army of ants floating across the water on leaves and twigs. The Oder was swarming with boatloads of men, rafts full of supplies, log floats supporting guns. Everywhere were the bobbing heads of men as they floated or swam across. At one point, Golbov saw his friend, the regimental doctor, a huge man named Nikolaev, running down the riverbank, dragging behind him a ridiculously small boat. Golbov knew that Nikolaev was supposed to stay behind the lines at the field hospital, but there he was in this tiny boat, rowing like hell. It seemed to Golbov that no power on earth could stop this onslaught. Abruptly, the bombardment ended, leaving a stunning silence. The cannonade had lasted a full 35 minutes. In Zhukov's command bunker, staff officers suddenly became aware that the phones were ringing. How long the sound had been going on, no one could say. All were suffering from some degree of deafness. Officers began taking the calls. Chuikov's commanders were making their first reports. "So far, everything is going as planned," Chuikov told Zhukov. A few moments later, he had even better news. "The first objectives have been taken," he announced proudly. Zhukov, a tense figure since the opening of the attack, became suddenly expansive. As General Popiel recalled, Zhukov seized Chuikov by the hand and said, "Excellent, excellent, very good indeed." But pleased as he was, Zhukov had too much experience to underestimate his enemy. The stocky marshal would feel better when the vital Silo Heights near Kustrin was seized. Then, he felt, success would be assured. Still, that should not take long. Apart from everything else, Russian bombers were now airborne and beginning to pound the areas ahead. More than 6,500 planes were scheduled to support his and Koniev's attacks. But Zhukov believed that the artillery bombardment alone must certainly have demoralized the enemy. In the operations room of his advance command post in the Schönewalder forest north of Berlin, Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici paced the floor, hands behind his back. Around him, telephones shrilled, and staff officers took reports, carefully transcribing the information onto the war map lying on a table in the center of the room. Every now and then, Heinrici paused in his pacing to glance at the map or to read a message handed him by Colonel Eismann. He was not surprised by the way the Russian offensive was being carried out, although most of his officers were awestruck by the massiveness of the bombardment. General Buss of the Ninth Army described it as the worst ever, and Colonel Eismann, basing his opinion on early reports, believed the annihilating fire had practically destroyed our front-line fortifications. Under darkness on the night of the 15th, the majority of the Vistula troops had swung back to the second line of positions as Heinrici had ordered. But there had been difficulties. Some officers had bitterly resented giving up their front-line positions. It looked to them as though they were retreating. Several commanders had complained to Heinrici. "Has it ever occurred to you," he inquired icily of one protesting general, "that nothing will be left of your nice front-line fortifications or of your men after the Russians open fire? If you're in a steel mill, you don't put your head under a trip hammer, do you? You pull it back in time. That is precisely what we're doing." The difficult stratagem had taken most of the night. From all reports, in the areas where troops had been withdrawn, the maneuver had proved successful. Now, in the second line, the men waited for the advancing Russians. On one part of the front, Heinrici had the advantage. West of Kustrin was the sandy, horseshoe-shaped plateau of the Silo Heights. It ranged in height from 100 to 200 feet and overlooked a spongy valley known, for the streams veining through it, as the Oderbruch. The Russians would have to cross this valley in their advance from the Oder, and all along the crescent-shaped plateau, Heinrici's guns were trained on the lines of approach. Here, on these critical heights, lay Heinrici's only chance to blunt Zhukov's attack, and Heinrici knew Zhukov would undoubtedly have given this fact great consideration in his planning. The Russians would need to seize the plateau quickly, before Heinrici's guns could shell the Red Army's Oder bridges and create havoc among the troops advancing across the low-lying, marshy terrain. Obviously, Zhukov had hoped to knock out almost all resistance with his massive bombardment, making the capture of the heights that much easier. But because of the German withdrawal from the front lines, the majority of Heinrici's army and artillery were intact and in position. The defensive plan had gone well. There was only one thing wrong. Heinrici did not have enough of either men or guns. Without Luftwaffe help in the air, and without reserves in men, guns, panzers, ammunition or fuel, Heinrici could only delay Zhukov's offensive. Eventually, his enemy must break through. Along the entire front, Heinrici's two armies had fewer than 700 operable tanks and self-propelled guns. These had been dispersed among the various units of the 9th and 3rd Armies. The heaviest division, the 25th Panzer, had 79 such vehicles. The smallest unit had 2. In contrast to Zhukov's artillery strength, 20,000 guns of all calibers, Heinrici had 744 guns, plus 600 anti-aircraft guns being used as artillery. Ammunition and fuel supplies were equally critical. Apart from shells stored at battery sites, the Ninth Army had reserves sufficient for only 2.5 days. Heinrici could not hold the Russians for any appreciable length of time, nor could he counterattack, because he had dispersed what little armour and artillery there was to give each unit a fighting chance. He could do only what he had known was possible all along. He could buy a little time. As Heinrici looked at the map and the thick red arrows marking the Russian advances, he thought bitterly of the panzers that had been transferred to Field Marshal Schörner's Southern Army Group to stem the Russian attack, which Hitler and Schörner had insisted was heading for Prague. Those armoured units would have given Heinrici 7 panzer divisions in all. "If I had them," he told Eismann sourly, "the Russians wouldn't be having much fun now." Bad as matters were, the crisis still lay ahead. Zhukov's attack was only the beginning. There were Rokossovsky's forces in the north to reckon with. How soon would they attack von Manteuffel's Third Army? And when would Konev launch his offensive in the south? Heinrici did not have to wait long to learn of Konev's intentions. The Russians' second blow came along the extreme southern edge of the line held by Buss's army and into Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner's sector. At exactly 6 a.m., the troops of Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front attacked across the river Neisse. In tight V formations, the red fighter planes banked and headed for the river through bursts of bright pink flak and streams of red, yellow, and white tracer bullets. Then, with dense clouds of white smoke pouring out behind them, they screamed up the valley, less than 50 feet above the metallic grey river Neisse. Again and again the fighters bored through the anti-aircraft barrage, laying a thick, fluffy blanket of smoke that obscured not only the river, but the eastern and western banks as well. Marshal Ivan Konev, watching from an observation post on a high point directly above the river, was well pleased. Turning to General N.P. Pukov, whose 13th Army would soon join in the assault, Konev said, "Our neighbours use searchlights, for they want more light. I tell you, Nikolai Pavlovich, we need more darkness." Although Konev was attacking on a front of about 50 miles, he had ordered the smoke screen laid over a distance almost 4 times as long to confuse the Germans. Now, watching through artillery glasses mounted on a tripod, Konev noted that the smoke was holding. The wind velocity had been figured at only 0.5 meter a second, no more than a mile an hour. With satisfaction, he announced that the screen was the right thickness and density and exactly the correct height. Then, as the planes continued to lay smoke, Konev's massed artillery opened up with a tremendous roar. His bombardment was as merciless as Zhukov's had been, but Konev used his artillery strength more selectively. Prior to the attack, Konev's artillery commanders, knowing their observers would be blinded by the smoke screen, had pinpointed every known defence line and enemy strongpoint on topographical maps, and had then zeroed in their guns. Besides hitting these pre-selected targets, the 1st Ukrainian guns were deliberately blasting out avenues running west from the Neisse for the assault troops and tanks that would follow. Rolling barrages, like fiery scythes, methodically chopped paths several hundred yards wide through the German positions. As they did, forests began blazing as they had in Zhukov's area, and seas of flame stretched away from the river for miles ahead. Konev was leaving nothing to chance. He was driven not only by his ambition to reach Berlin before Zhukov, but by another, even more important reason, the unexpected speed of the Western Allies, who were now only 40 miles from the city. Konev thought one or both of 2 things might happen. Eisenhower's forces might try to reach the capital before the Red Army, and the Germans probably would attempt to make a separate peace with the Western Allies. As Konev was later to put it, "We did not want to believe that our allies would enter into any sort of separate agreement with the Germans. However, in the atmosphere, which abounded in both fact and rumour, we as military men had no right to exclude the possibility. This gave the Berlin operations special urgency. We had to consider the possibility that the fascist leaders would prefer to surrender Berlin to the Americans and British rather than to us. The Germans would open the way for them, but with us they would fight fiercely and to the last soldier. In his planning, Koniev had soberly considered the prospect. In order to beat either Marshal Zhukov or the Western Allies to Berlin, Koniev knew that he had to overwhelm the enemy within the first few hours of his attack. Unlike Zhukov, Koniev had no infantry-filled bridgehead on the Neisse's western bank. He had to hurdle the river in force, and it was a formidable obstacle. The Neisse was an icy, swift-flowing river. In places it was 150 yards wide, and although the eastern banks were relatively flat, the western shore sloped up steeply. The Germans had taken full advantage of these natural defences. They were now entrenched in a number of heavily fortified concrete bunkers overlooking the river and its eastern approaches. Koniev had to overwhelm the enemy quickly if he was to avoid being pinned down by fire from these bunkers. His plan called for armoured divisions to be thrown into the attack the moment footholds were secured on the western banks. But that meant building bridges across the river even before the protective smoke screen dissipated, and if the bombardment had not knocked out the enemy, it might have to be done under heavy fire. He intended to make his main crossing in the area of Buchholz and Triebel, but there would also be others. Koniev, convinced that he must achieve the complete and rapid smothering of the enemy, had ordered an enormous river assault, with crossings at more than 150 places. At each site, his engineers had vowed to have bridges or ferries available in 1 to 3 hours. At 6:55 a.m., the second stage of Koniev's plan unfolded. All along the eastern bank, first-wave troops emerged from the forests under cover of the continuing artillery fire and, in a miscellaneous collection of boats, headed across the Neisse. Immediately behind them came a second wave of men, and behind them a third. In the Buchholz-Triebel area, shock troops of Puchow's 13th Army swarmed across the choppy waters, dragging sections of pontoon bridges. Leading the way was the 6th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by Major General Georgy Ivanov, a tough 44-year-old Cossack. Ivanov had put everything that would float into the water. Besides pontoons, he used empty aviation fuel tanks and large German fertilizer bins, which he had ordered welded to make them airtight. These were manhandled into position as bridging supports. In the water were hundreds of engineers. As fast as prefabricated wooden bridge sections were pushed off the eastern bank, the engineers bolted them together. Scores of men stood neck-deep in the icy Neisse holding heavy bridging beams above their heads, while others drove wooden supports into the riverbed. Special teams of engineers hauled cables across the Neisse in boats equipped with hand-operated winches. On the western bank they set up ferry heads and then manually wound in the cables, pulling floats with guns and tanks across the river. At some places, engineers got guns across without the ferry floats. They simply dragged them along the riverbed on the end of the cables. The operations were moving steadily forward despite enemy fire nearly everywhere along the line. To protect the crossings, Ivanov used shore batteries which fired directly above the heads of his troops and into the German defences on the western bank. He supported these batteries with a hail of fire from no less than 200 machine guns, just to keep their heads down. At 7:15 a.m., Koniev got good news. The first bridgehead had been seized on the western bank. 1 hour later he learned that tanks and self-propelled guns had been ferried across and were already engaging the enemy. By 8:35 a.m., at the end of a 2-hour and 35-minute bombardment, Koniev knew with absolute certainty that his troops were well established west of the Neisse. They had so far secured 133 of the 150 crossings. Units of Puchow's 13th Army, together with forces of the Third Guards Tank Army, had already punched through the centre in the assault area at Triebel, and by all accounts the enemy in front of them seemed to have cracked. The armour of the 4th Guards Tank Army was now moving across in the same sector, and to the south men of the 5th Guards Army were over the river. It looked to Koniev as if his tanks might achieve a breakthrough at any moment. Once that was accomplished, Koniev planned to dash for the cities of Spremberg and Cottbus. Past Cottbus, he would head out on the roadnet for Luben. That area held special interest for Koniev. It was the terminal point of the boundary line laid down by Stalin, separating Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and his own First Ukrainian Front. If Koniev got there fast enough, he planned to ask Stalin immediately for permission to swing north and head for Berlin. Confident of the go-ahead, Koniev had already sent written orders to Colonel General Pavel Semenovich Rybalko of the Third Guards Tank Army to be prepared to break into Berlin from the south, with a tank corps reinforced with a rifle division from the Third Guards Army. It looked to Koniev as though he might just beat Zhukov to the city. He was so engrossed in the progress of his attack that he did not realize how lucky he was to be alive. In the first moments of the assault, a sniper's bullet had drilled a neat hole through the tripod of his artillery glasses, inches away from Koniev's head. On the eastern fringes of Berlin, the hammering of the guns, less than 35 miles away, was like the sullen thunder of a far-off storm. In small villages and towns nearer the Oder, there were some strange concussion effects. In the police station at Malsdorf, books fell off their shelves and telephones rang for no reason. Lights dimmed and flickered in many areas. In Dahlwitz-Hoppegarten, an air raid siren suddenly went berserk and no one could switch it off. Pictures fell from walls, windows and mirrors shattered. A cross hurtled down from the steeple of a church in Müncheberg, and everywhere dogs began to howl. In the eastern districts of Berlin, the muffled sound echoed and re-echoed in the skeletal, fire-blackened ruins. The fragrant smell of burning pines wafted across the fringes of Köpenick. Along the edges of Weissensee and Lichtenberg, a sudden wind caused curtains to whip and flap with ghostly abandon, and in Erkner some inhabitants of air raid shelters were jolted out of sleep, not by noise, but by a sickening vibration of the earth. Many Berliners knew the sound for what it was. In the Moorings-Pankow apartment where the Veltlingers were hiding, Siegmund, who had been a World War I artilleryman, instantly recognized the far-off sound as that of a massive artillery bombardment. He woke his wife Margareta to tell her about it. At least one Berliner claimed to have actually seen Zhukov's rolling barrage. Shortly after 4 a.m., 16-year-old Horst Romling climbed a 7-story tower on the western edge of Weissensee and stared eastward through field glasses. Horst quickly informed the neighbours he had seen the flash and glare of Russian guns, but few believed him. He was considered a wild, fanciful boy at best. The sound did not penetrate the central districts, although here and there some Berliners claimed they heard something unusual. Most thought it was probably anti-aircraft fire, or the detonation of unexploded bombs dropped during the night's 2-hour and 25-minute air raid, or perhaps the sudden collapse of a bomb-blasted building. One small group of civilians learned almost immediately that the Russian offensive had started. They were the operators in the main post office telephone building on Winterfeldstrasse in Schöneberg. Within minutes of the opening barrage, long-distance and trunk-line sections of the exchange were jammed with calls. Nervous Nazi Party officials in areas near the Oder and Neisse called administrative heads in Berlin. Fire brigade chiefs asked whether they should try to put out the forest fires or move their equipment out of the areas. Police chiefs phoned their superiors, and everybody tried to get through to relatives. As operators were to recall years later, nearly all those completing calls began their conversations with 2 words. "It's begun." Switchboard supervisor Elizabeth Milbrand, a devout Catholic, took out her beads and silently said the rosary. By 8 a.m. on April 16th, most of Berlin had heard on the radio that heavy Russian attacks continue on the Oder front. The news announcements were guarded, but the average Berliner needed no elaboration. By word of mouth or from relatives outside the city, people learned that the moment they had dreaded had finally arrived. Curiously, at this time the man in the street knew more than Hitler. In the Führer bunker, the leader was still sleeping. He had retired a little before 3 a.m., and General Bergdorf, his adjutant, had given strict instructions that the Führer was not to be awakened. The strange subterranean world of the bunker had an almost cheerful look that morning. There were vases of bright tulips in the little anteroom, the corridor lounge, and the small conference room. Earlier, one of the Reichskanzlei gardeners had cut them from the few flower beds that still remained in the bomb-pitted gardens. It had seemed a good idea to Burgdorf because Eva Braun loved tulips. The Reich's unwed First Lady had arrived the night before. With her, she had brought some presents for the Führer from old friends in Munich. One was a book sent by Baroness Beidur von Schirach, wife of the former Reich youth leader. The novel's hero bore every misfortune without losing hope. Optimism, he was made to say, is a mania for maintaining that all is well when things are going badly. The Baroness had thought the book a most appropriate choice. It was Voltaire's Candide. At first, Zhukov did not believe the news. Standing in the Kustrin command post, surrounded by his staff, he stared incredulously at Zhukov and then spluttered in rage. "What the hell do you mean? Your troops are pinned down!" he yelled at the 8th Guards army commander, and this time there was no friendly use of the general's given names. Zhukov had seen Zhukov angry before, and he remained perfectly calm. "Comrade Marshal," he said, "whether we are pinned down temporarily or not, the offensive will most certainly succeed. But resistance has stiffened for the moment and is holding us up." Heavy artillery fire from the Silo heights had hit the troops and supporting tank units as they advanced, Zhukov explained. Also, the terrain through which they were moving was proving extremely difficult for armour. In the marshes and irrigation canals of the Oderbruch, self-propelled guns and tanks were thrashing and churning helplessly. A number of mired tanks had been hit, one after another, and had gone up in flames. Up to now, said Zhukov, his 8th Guards had advanced only 1,500 yards. Zhukov, according to General Popiel, gave vent to his fury with a stream of extremely forceful expressions. What had happened to the supposedly irresistible offensive? There were a variety of opinions, as General Popiel quickly discovered when he checked Zhukov's senior officers. General Mikhail Shalin, a corps commander of the 1st Guards Army, told Popiel he was certain the Germans had been pulled out of the front lines before the attack and placed in a second defensive line along the Silo heights. Therefore, said Shalin, the majority of our shells fell in open country. General Vasily Kuznetsov, commander of the 3rd Shock Army, was bitterly critical of the first Belarusian plan. As usual, he told Popiel, we stuck to the book, and by now the Germans know our methods. They pulled back their troops a good 8 kilometers. Our artillery fire hit everything but the enemy. General Andrea Getman, a ranking tank expert and corps commander in Katukov's 1st Guards tank army, was both critical and angry, particularly about the searchlights. They didn't blind the main forces of the enemy, he said. But I'll tell you what they did do. They absolutely spotlighted our tanks and infantry for the German gunners. Zhukov had never expected the attack to be easy, but although he had anticipated heavy casualties, he had deemed it virtually impossible for the Germans to halt his advance. As he later put it, he had counted on a rapid reduction of the enemy's defences. Instead, he added in a massive understatement, the blow by the front's first echelon had proved to be inadequate. He had no doubt that by sheer weight of armies alone he could overwhelm the enemy, but he was bothered by the danger which now arose that the offensive might be slowed. Zhukov decided to change his tactics. Quickly, he rapped out a series of orders. His bomber fleets were to concentrate on the enemy gun positions. At the same time, artillery was to begin pounding the heights. Then Zhukov took one more step. Although originally his tank armies were not to be committed until after the Silo heights had been seized, Zhukov now decided to throw them in immediately. General Katukov, commander of the 1st Guards tank army, who happened to be in the bunker, got his orders direct. Zhukov left no doubt as to what he wanted. The heights were to be captured, whatever the cost. Zhukov was going to bludgeon the enemy into submission and, if necessary, bulldoze his way to Berlin. Then, followed by his staff, the stocky marshal left the command post, his anger over the delay still evident. Zhukov had no intention of being slowed up by a few well-placed enemy guns, nor did he intend to be beaten to Berlin by Konev. On his way out of the bunker, as officers stood aside respectfully to let him pass, he suddenly turned to Katukov and snapped, "Well, get moving." The Führer's order of the day reached General Theodor Busse's 9th Army headquarters a little after midday. It was dated April 15th, but apparently had been held until Hitler's staff was certain that the main Russian offensive had begun. Commanders were ordered to disseminate the paper at once, down to company level, but on no account was it to be published in the public newspapers. "Soldiers of the German Eastern Front," it read. "For the last time the deadly Jewish Bolshevist enemy is going over to the attack with his hordes. He is trying to smash Germany and exterminate our people. You soldiers in the East already know the fate which threatens German women, girls, and children. The old men and children will be murdered. Women and girls will be reduced to army camp whores. The remainder will go to Siberia. We have expected this attack, and since January everything has been done to build up a strong front. The enemy is confronted by a tremendous amount of artillery. Losses in our infantry have been filled in with countless new units. Alarm units, newly organized units, and the Volkssturm are reinforcing our front. This time the Bolshevist will experience the old fate of Asia. He must and shall fall before the capital city of the German Reich. Whoever does not do his duty at this moment is a traitor to our people. Any regiment or division which leaves its position acts so disgracefully that it must be ashamed before the women and children who are withstanding the bomb terror in our cities. Take heed especially of the few traitorous officers and soldiers who, in order to save their miserable lives, will fight against us for Russian pay, perhaps even wearing German uniforms. Anyone ordering you to retreat, unless you know him well, is to be taken prisoner at once and, if necessary, killed on the spot, no matter what his rank may be. If every soldier at the Eastern Front does his duty in the coming days and weeks, the last onrush of Asia will be broken. Exactly as in the end, the penetration of our enemy in the West will fail in spite of everything. Berlin will remain German, Vienna will be German once more, and Europe will never be Russian. Swear a solemn oath to defend, not the empty concept of a fatherland, but your homes, your wives, your children, and thus our future. In these hours the whole German people look to you, my warriors in the East, and only hope that thanks to your constancy, your fanaticism, your weapons, and your leadership, the Bolshevist onrush will be smothered in its own blood. At the moment when fate has removed the greatest war criminal of all time from the earth, the turning point of this war will be decided. Busse did not need an order of the day to tell him that the Russians had to be stopped. Months ago he had told Hitler that if the Russians broke through the Oder line, Berlin and the remainder of Germany would fall. But he was angry to read the talk of a strong front, of an enemy confronted by a tremendous amount of artillery and countless new units. Bold words would not stop the Russians. Hitler's order of the day was, for the most part, fiction. On one point, however, it was crystal clear. Hitler intended German soldiers to fight to the death, against both West and East. Busse had harboured a secret hope, so guarded that he had never voiced it aloud to anyone except Heinrici and certain of his closest commanders. He had wanted to stand fast on the Oder long enough for the Americans to arrive. As he put it to Heinrici, "If we can hold until the Americans get here, we will have fulfilled our mission before our people, our country, and history." Heinrici had responded tartly. "Don't you know about eclipse?" he asked. Busse had never heard of it. Heinrici told him of the captured plan showing the Allied lines of demarcation and projected zones of occupation. "I doubt," said Heinrici, "that the Americans will even cross the Elbe." Despite all, Busse had continued for a time to cling to the idea. Now he finally abandoned it. Even if Eisenhower's forces were to cross the Elbe and drive for Berlin, it was probably too late. Among other things, Hitler was obviously prepared to contest bitterly every mile of an American advance. He was making no distinction between the democracies and the communists. Germany's position was hopeless, so Busse believed was the Ninth Army's. But as long as Hitler continued the war and refused to capitulate, Buss could only try to hold the Russians, as he was doing, up to the very last moment. The 9th had taken the full brunt of the Russian attacks. It could not take much more. Yet Buss's forces were still holding nearly everywhere. At Frankfurt they had actually thrown the Russians back.